could I ask Stan, can you see the screen when I share it? Can you see it pretty
Yes.
well?
Yes.
So let me ask you to just go ahead and read an extraordinary thing about the Akedah. It's really just 19 sentences. This was not Dickens who was paid by the word. This story was accomplished with an incredible economy of language. So it won't take us much time to reread. Go ahead, Stan.
Sometime afterward, God put Abraham to the test. He said to him, Avraham, and he answered, Hineni, here I am. And he said, take your son, your favored one, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the heights that I will point out to you. So the next morning, Abraham saddled his ass and took with him 2 of his servants and his son Yitzchak. He split the wood for the burnt offering, and he set out for the place of which God had told him. B'yom Shlishi, Abraham looked up and saw the place from afar, then said to his servants, you stay here with the ass, the boy and I will go up there, we will worship, and we will return to you. Somehow when I read the Hebrew, I can't equate that word with the name they're giving to the donkey. Anyway, let's see where we are.
Verse 6.
Thank you. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and put it on his son Isaac. He himself took the firestone and the knife, and the 2 walked off together, biyachad. Then Isaac said to his father, Avraham, father, and he answered, yes, my son. And he said, here are the firestone and the wood, but where is the sheep for the burnt offering? Vayomer Avraham, God will see to the sheep for his burnt offering, my son. And the 2 of them walked together. They arrived at the place of which God had told them. Abraham built an altar there. He laid out the wood. He bound his son Isaac. He laid him on the altar on top of the wood, and Abraham picked up the knife to slay his son. Then an angel of the Lord called to him from heaven, Avraham, Avraham, and he answered, Vayomer Hineni, and he said, do not raise your hand against the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your favored one, from me. When God looked up, his eye fell upon a ram caught in the...
When Abraham looked up.
I'm sorry. When Abraham looked up, his eye fell upon a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it as a burnt offering in place of his son. And Abraham named that site as Adonai Yireh, whence the present saying, on the mount of the Lord there is vision. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, by myself I swear, the Lord declares, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your favored one, I will bestow my blessing upon you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars of heaven and the sands on the seashore. And your descendants shall seize the gates of their foes. All the nations of the earth shall bless themselves by your descendants, because you have obeyed my command. Abraham returned to his servants, and they departed for Be'er Sheva, and Abraham stayed in Be'er Sheva.
Okay. Briefly, it's impossible to read this in my mind without at least taking a couple of minutes for questions. The story, obviously, in my mind, raises many more questions than it answers. what are the questions that are raised by this story for you? Richard, don't forget to take yourself off mute when you're called on.
My question this time is, what was Isaac doing? I mean, there's no word about his reaction to all of this. I mean, he's lying there about to be slaughtered. You're not screaming and yelling or something?
So there's one question is Isaac going along with this willingly, or is this happening against his will? Also, the rabbis try to figure out how old is he, right? What are the various possibilities? Is he a young boy? Some of the rabbis put him at 37 years old. What else are questions? Just Judy?
Is it possible that just as God was testing Abraham, Abraham was testing God? Because initially he says to the servants, we shall return. And then when Isaac asks him, Father, where is the sacrifice? And he answers him, God will provide the sacrifice. And in fact, that's exactly how it ended.
So to what extent is Abraham aware that this is a test that's never going to be fulfilled on? And Elie Wiesel, I spoke about this a few years ago, talks about this as a game of chicken with God, that Abraham is essentially pushing God to say, is this what you really want, right? Is this, and pushes as far. Other questions that come up for you when you're reading it?
Oh,
Harold?
I'm sorry.
Oh, Martha, go ahead, and then Harold.
I have to comment, since you mentioned Elie Wiesel, that I'll never forget his pointing out that Abraham comes down to the servants alone, and through that whole parsha kept talking about together. He did this together, Abraham and Isaac, but Abraham returns to the servants alone. So that, to me, says something about what Isaac's reaction was to the whole experience. I imagine their relationship was never the same. Father and son.
I would say great, meaning thank you for that point, right? It's not great that it seems to sever the relationship between father and son. Harold, go ahead.
Well, it seems like such an awful thing to me. I mean, my main question is, how can this, in any way square with being moral, with being with respecting human dignity?
To which I want to say yes. Thank you. Right. I think that's sort of the big question, people. Right. Is how can God, right, who is a source of morality, make this demand, right, or make this test, right? So I want to walk through the very complicated arguments of this book. I will do my best to do it justice. I commend the book to you. I'll be reading a few excerpts, but I'm going to do my best, instead of trying to read everything to you, to explain Kohler's analysis of this. So he begins with, he does a wonderful job of walking through some of the ways in which the Akedah is understood in Rabbinic Judaism. And by Rabbinic Judaism, I mean the period of 200 to 500, and then it changes through the Middle Ages, and he has a whole other talk that he's given on the way in which the Jewish understandings of that are impacted by the way that Christians understand the story and Muslims understand the story. But he focuses on as the subtitle says, the significance of the Akedah from modern Jewish thought. And to do so, he begins with the understanding of Kierkegaard. So Kierkegaard is writing, I think, in the 19th century. He's from a school of philosophy called existentialism. And very famously in an essay called Fear and Trembling, describes Abraham as a knight of faith and holds up Abraham and his actions in the Akedah as the model for religious faith, for Christian faith, for religious faith. And that faith has two primary elements to it. Number one, that that Abraham is solitary, meaning that against all conventions, against all understandings of what is ethical that come from the community, Abraham alone is given the command by God to sacrifice his son, and obeys this command that is what Kierkegaard famously says is that this is a temporary suspension and a teleological suspension of the ethical, where instead of ethical norms that exist before the Akedah and exist after the Akedah represents a temporary suspension of those ethical norms, and the extent to which ethical norms come from the outside of oneself and from a community. The faith of Abraham is entirely individual, and what we're reading about is a particular communication between Abraham and God. So it's solitary, and the other element of this faith is that it's also silent. It is Abraham's very acquiescence to the will of God, and the fact that he does not argue, as he does earlier with Sodom and Gomorrah, that makes this a peak moment of faith. I'm going to read to you just a couple of paragraphs that Kohler cites. If you're going to get the book, I'll just tell you the page numbers as I go. This from page 36, and this is from Kierkegaard's essay, Fear and Trembling. Abraham cannot be mediated, which can also be expressed by saying he cannot speak. As soon as I speak, I express the universal, and if I do not do that, then no one can understand me. So the whole essence of speaking is the idea that I can use words, and these words are what allow us to bridge the gap or the chasm that exists between individuals, to enable us to understand each other. So all speech is in a certain way communal and public, and because the Akedah and this moment of faith is entirely individual, it also is it's impossible to communicate whatsoever. And what this leads to is an understanding. There's one other aspect of this that I found fascinating. I'll just read the excerpt from the top of 45. It says, Kierkegaard breaks with the tradition. Isaac is hardly mentioned in Fear and Trembling. So we're going to come back to this. But one of the things that and you can feel this, the title that the rabbis give this incident is the binding of Isaac, Akedat Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac, because Isaac later, the rabbis give him that title in the Middle Ages because he's held up as an example of Jewish faith, because many Jews were being martyred. But for Kierkegaard, Isaac essentially disappears from the story, and the entire significance of the story centers around not Isaac, but around Abraham's willingness to go about this sacrifice. And I'll read you the sentence. He says, instead, the hero of the Akedah is Abraham, who is not just the sacrificer, but the sacrificed. Abraham, the ethical person of Abraham is sacrificed. He finds resurrection, so to speak, in the realm beyond ethics. Okay? So within Kierkegaard's formulation, the hero of the story is Abraham, who does something individual, which is removed from communal understandings of the ethical. It's temporary, communal understandings of the ethical, but before and after the Akedah takes place. And the hero of the story, it's precisely in Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his own sense of the ethical that makes him the hero of the story, both as the sacrificer, but also Abraham as a character is sacrificed as well. I'm not arguing for, I actually, I would say I'm not arguing against, but I think I am going to argue against this because Kohler ends up arguing against this. But I at least want to do our best to understand the way in which Kierkegaard, number one, Kierkegaard understands Abraham as a model of faith, as a knight of faith, and then and the way that his understanding may end up impacting some Jewish thinkers from the same time period. And I'm not going to go into the intellectual scholarship that Kohler does in terms of whether or not some of these thinkers literally read Fear and Trembling and knew Kierkegaard, or whether they were all part of the existentialist and many of these ideas are important in the Protestant Reformation, but whether Jewish thinkers are impacted by Kierkegaard or just by the intellectual climate taking place. But what is significant is that there are Jewish thinkers who seem to move in a similar direction. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of those. The first is someone named Rabbi Meir Leibush Visser, who's known as Malbim, which is an acronym for Meir Levush. The Malbim, he's also, I think, a later 19th century commentator. And I'm going to read you an excerpt from the Malbim's discussion of the Akedah. And you can find this in Kohler on page 60. The Malbim says, when Abraham says to the servants, "You stay here with the donkey," the Malbim says as follows: "Thus it is told that this test differed from all else that Abraham did up to this point." So for those of you who don't know, Abraham, according to Pirkei Avot, endured 10 trials or 10 tests in his life, and they culminated with the test of the Akedah. But this test differed from everything that Abraham did up since. Why did it differ? Everything Abraham did until now to walk in the ways of God and keeping his injunctions and commandments involved commandments that did not violate the intellect. So every command that he fulfilled, he did publicly for all to see, so that all the people of the land would know God and guard his path to act justly and righteously. Okay, so, and by the way, I'll just tell you a little story. This morning I had a nice conversation with Rabbi Nussen, who is the Chabad rabbi for Duke. And at the end of the conversation, we each sort of left each other with a word of Torah. And I asked him, do you have some Torah to leave me with? And what he spoke about was that Noah is known as a righteous man. I guess somebody helped me with the Yiddish, with a tzaddik bepelts, right? I guess pelts are fur. Is that right? Am I getting that right? And so the idea is that there are two, if it's cold, right, there are two things you can do. One of them is you can put on your fur coat, or the other one is you can turn on the heat, right? And one of them keeps you warm and the other one keeps everybody else warm. So Noah is known as being I'm not getting this phrase right, but a tzaddik bepeltz, right? So sort of a righteous man in fur, and it means what did he do? The world was falling apart, but he put on a coat, right? He made himself an ark and he kept himself and his family safe, but he didn't argue on behalf of the world. Abraham, right? Rabbi Nussin was telling me, and this is true. Abraham and Sarah in next week's Torah portion, they have a tent that's open on all sides. They invite guests in very famously when they're visited. And in rabbinic literature, Abraham is known. There's another phrase in the book of Genesis where it says that kol hanifashot asher asu b'Haran, that all of the souls which Abraham and Sarah acquired in Haran. Abraham was known in rabbinic literature as somebody who was going out and not only believing in God and sort of having an idea of monotheism, but was spreading that idea and creating a family and creating a clan and sort of spreading that idea in the world. That's according to the rabbis. And so the Malbim is saying, up until this point, everything that Abraham did was not only sort of made sense, but was done in a public way in order to what we would call do Kiddush Hashem, to sanctify God's name, to spread the good news, right? If we want to use language from another tradition. Abraham was in the proselytizing business, right? He was out there for God and he was doing everything publicly. But this command, says Malbim, was different. It violated his intellect. Okay? So the Malbim says very, very clearly, this command of God doesn't make sense. Right? It goes against our notions of right and wrong. He says, until now, he had argued against idolaters who offered human sacrifices, arguing that God did not want such abominations and that there was no greater abomination in God's eyes than homicide. And now that this command, which violated his intellect and violated God's good ways, so the Malbim is saying very specifically, this command violates God's good ways. This violates God's idea of what is good. When this command reached him, he did not want to fulfill it in front of his servants. So Stan, to your point about this moment when, or I think Judy, you said, Abraham says, says to the servants, stay here, right? The Malbim is saying the reason that he said to his servants, stay here, is what I'm about to do is actually wrong, and I don't want you to witness it because you won't understand it, right? And that gets back to that Kierkegaardian notion of Abraham is in a moment that is ultimately impossible to communicate because it is solely between him and God. He says he didn't want to fulfill it in front of the servants, for he was ashamed to do something in front of them that until now he had held to be an abomination. And he also did not want them to learn to do likewise. Therefore, he hid it from them and said, we will bow down and we will return to you, right? But you stay here with the donkey, okay? So the Malbim is one example of someone who, again, the argument here isn't that he's following, that he's making this argument because of Kierkegaard, but he's making a similar sort of argument that the Akedah was a command from God that was ultimately demanding the temporary, what Kierkegaard calls the temporary suspension of the ethical. Another thinker from this, not from the 19th century, but from the 20th century, who seems to go in this direction is Yeshayahu Leibovitz, or Leibovitz. Yeshayahu Leibovitz, he was a scholar in his own right, but he's also very important. He's I think the sister of, and somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the sister of Nechama Leibovitz. Nechama Leibovitz was, I think, arguably one of the greatest Torah scholars of the 20th century, certainly in modern Israel. Very famous for her teaching of the commentators and the method through which she taught. Leibovitz is one of Israel's philosophers a great public intellectual. And what Leibovitz argues is that when, and this is a truly radical idea, that when Abraham argues with God during this the incident of Sodom and Gomorrah, saying to God, "Shall the judge of the earth do justly?" And I want to say this is sort of a part of Abraham that I think as moderns we love. Leibovitz says that's actually a mistake, right? That Abraham speaking up like that is a mistake and a flaw in Abraham's personality and in his development, and that as the story goes on, Abraham learns that it was a mistake, and the Akedah is where ultimately Abraham, where that mistake in his character gets corrected. Okay, there's a very, very radical notion. I'm going to read you a paragraph on page 69. In the Akedah, God asks Abraham to do something grossly immoral. No sophisticated moral philosophy is needed to reach the conclusion that one ought not kill one's son or most anyone else. When Abraham fulfills the immoral divine command, showing that he understands that obedience to God necessitates the abandonment of all ethics, God commends him as one who fears God. So, Stan, you know this, at the end of the story, as moderns, we would love for the story to end with God saying, Abraham, what were you thinking? How could you do that, right? But it doesn't end that way, right? At the end of the story, God commends him and says, now that I know that you are one who truly fears God. For Leibovitz, the fact that God completes the story by commending him as one who fears God, the Akedah then is the episode in which Abraham learns the lesson that for Leibovitz is the archetype of all true religion, that true devotion to God takes no heed of human considerations, even of basic moral judgments. Leibovitz, you can sense, by the way, some of the, and there are people here who are better philosophers than I, but when Kant is writing about the moral duty and obedience, you can hear some of that philosophy and maybe some Hegel as well. Leibovitz was a student of these. And for Leibovitz, the ultimate in religion is obedience to God, and anything that isn't about strict obedience to God actually is self-worship. It's egotistical. So Leibovitz will very famously say in another setting that when you pray, that praying from the Siddur, from the Jewish prayer book, should be the same thing as praying from a phone book. Now, some of you may be, some of you may feel that way or may say, yeah, that sounds familiar. I hope not, right? But what he's saying when he says that is the essence of prayer and the authenticity and the truth of prayer is obeying God's command to pray. And to the extent that you're enjoying it is the extent that you're not worshiping God, you're worshiping yourself. And that's a corruption of religion rather than an enactment of religion, okay? And so Leibovitz actually, and Kohler writes about this in the book, that Leibovitz in some ways is taking Kierkegaard and putting him on steroids. Because while Kierkegaard argues that the Akedah is a supreme, Abraham is a knight of faith, it's only a temporary suspension of the ethical. Leibovitz actually says that ideally, ethics play no role in religion. He's not saying that unethical is better. He's just saying that ethics is a different sphere and that religion is about obedience, and the extent to which not only temporarily, but they ever intersect is the extent to which religion is actually corrupted. Okay, I mean, not okay, but okay. And then a third one that I'm not going to walk you through, but he actually shows that Joseph Ber Soloveitchik, who is another incredibly important 20th century Jewish thinker, seems to go in this direction as well. So I'm not arguing for any of these, but I am trying to explain them. And I think the other thing which I would say is, I hope you can feel the power of the argument, that you can feel almost the temptation and the power of this way of thinking, even if you say, ew, yuck, okay? Before I go on with the second part of this, let me stop and just take 2 or 3 minutes. First of all, I hope you're still awake. I hope you find this interesting. And I'm just curious if I can answer any questions that have come up so far. Judy?
Sorry, Rabbi, but I would love to hear. There was a movement, a very important movement in Eastern Europe, called the Musa movement, which emphasized the doing of good deeds, the ethics of Judaism. And I'd love to know what their take was on this. I'm not asking that you give this now, but maybe in the next Lunch and Learn, you might take 3 minutes, because I have a feeling it's a completely different take.
I imagine it is, and I'll see what I can do between now and then.
Thank you.
Any other reactions or questions? Nancy? Take yourself off mute, Nancy.
It seems that this rationale could be used by any murderer to, you know, I have a pathway to the voice in my head, and anyway, it's
Nancy, I think part of the a very deep criticism of this is how dangerous it is.
Oh, you bet.
And the potential for it being used to justify religious extremism. And it's one of the reasons, by the way, that I think, so let me now move on to the second part, but I really appreciate that comment. I think that Kohler's book is very important, not only because he's doing some digging around what are some of the intellectual foundations of religious extremism, but for the following reason, and I've spoken about this in other settings. If you want to fight religious extremism, the way in which to do that cannot be to say, oh, stop taking those texts so seriously. Because people who are religious extremists take religious texts seriously. And I would like to say, I'm a rabbi, and I also take religious texts seriously. And I don't want to, I'm not interested, I'm not out there judging anybody who wants to walk away from this. But I think there's important work to do within religion that says, I take this text seriously, and because I take it seriously and I feel its call upon me, I need to respond. And how do I respond in a different way than the way that has just been outlined? Okay. And I want to give you, I want to walk you through Kohler's argument for not only a different way to understand the Akedah, but importantly, for a different, serious Jewish way to understand the Akedah. And ultimately, he will argue that the 19th century, that the 18th, 19th, and 20th century understandings of the Akedah that I just walked you through are actually quite unnormative. So they're not only not normative, but they're also aberrations from within 2,000 years of rabbinic Jewish understandings of these stories. So let me begin the process. So first of all, one thing that he does is he holds up a reading of Maimonides, okay? Maimonides in the Guide for the Perplexed gives, when Maimonides is describing how prophecy works, he says that there are levels of prophecy. And other rabbis have said this as well, that Moses has the highest level of prophecy because Moses speaks to God face to face. In other words, God appears to Moses in the same way as you and I see each other on Zoom, but even better, okay? The power doesn't go out on Moses, right? I don't know, Brian, if you're still there. Brian's having power problems because if there's a hurricane force in this area. Okay? And that actually the lower level of prophecy, the less clear and everyday are the prophetic descriptions. So actually one of the lowest levels of prophecy in the Bible is experienced by Ezekiel, okay? And if you've ever read Ezekiel, when you read Ezekiel and his description of the chariot, it's a good argument for the fact that LSD, may have existed during the time of the Bible. It's Ezekiel's vision of the chariot is psychedelic, okay? I don't know whether he's on mushrooms or on other psychedelic drugs, but you really get the sense of this guy is crazy, right? This is really whack, okay? And what's important is that the rabbis don't say, oh, the more crazy and outlandish the vision, the deeper it must be. In the Kabbalists, right, scholars of Jewish mysticism will obviously, grab onto that. But within normative Judaism, it's really Moses who's at the top and Ezekiel who's at the bottom, because Moses is clear and Ezekiel is crazy and difficult to understand and esoteric. And I'm going to read to you on page 133. Kohler brings from the Guide to the Perplexed two levels. He brings others as well, but I'm just going to read to you the 7th level of prophecy, which is like mid-level, and then the highest level of prophecy, okay? So Maimonides says that the 7th level of prophecy is when a prophet sees in a prophetic dream, as if he, may God be exalted, speaks to the prophet, as it said with regard to Isaiah. And Isaiah says, quote, I saw the Lord, and he said, whom shall I send, right? And all of this was in a dream. It's Isaiah 6, verses 1 through 8. I'm not going to get it for you, but you can go look, and it's very clearly in a dream, okay? And I'm now going to share my screen for a second, okay? And I want to point something out to you. At the beginning of the Akedah, what did we read? Whoops, let's see if I can do this. Stan, you've read this, okay? It says, God put Abraham to the test. Here I am, take your son, only one, Isaac, the one whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him as a burnt offering. somebody came off mute and we're hearing an echo, so please go back on mute. On one of the heights that I will point out, how does verse 3 begin? Read for us the beginning of verse 3, just the first phrase.
So early next morning, Abraham saddled his ass and took with him 2 of his
Okay,
servants.
good. All right. And what's the Hebrew?
I need to see the English again.
Vayashkem Avraham Baboker. Okay,
Yelech,
but that's enough. That's good. Okay. Vayachavosh et chamoro. Okay. Vayashkem Avraham Baboker. He got up early in the morning. So first God appears to Abraham and tells him, do this. And then early the next morning, he saddles his ass. Just intuitively, how do you think God might have been speaking to Abraham when he said, go sacrifice your son?
In a dream.
In a prophetic dream.
right.
Maimonides is going to say that when God tells Abraham to sacrifice his son, he's appearing to him in a dream. And that's level 7. Now let me read you level 11. Okay. Level 11 is, and it's the highest level of prophecy, I think, besides Moses, okay, that he sees an angel speaking to him. Okay. And Maimonides actually says explicitly, because he wants to make sure that you get the point, okay? Maimonides says, like at the time of the Akedah, and the way he finishes that section of Guide for the Perplexed is he says, this is, in my view, the highest levels of the prophets, the highest level of the prophets that the books testify about their states, okay? And Moses is in another category. And Stan, read for me verse 15.
The angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven.
Stop. Okay. Oh, and by the way, right, if you go up, even before that, who is it, right? I'm not going to tease you through this. Who is it that tells Abraham to stop and not to sacrifice? Verse 11, then an angel of the Lord called to God from heaven and says, don't sacrifice Isaac. So what Kohler points out is that according to Maimonides, Abraham is going in the exact opposite direction than Leibovitz. For Leibovitz, Sodom and Gomorrah is when Abraham is at a lower level because he actually takes ethics into consideration and he evolves to the highest level by being willing to sacrifice his son in total obedience against all measures of what is right and good. Maimonides argues that two important things. Number one, that it's moving in the exact opposite direction. That when Abraham seems to respond to God's command to sacrifice his son, he's at a lower level of prophecy. And when Abraham doesn't do it, he's actually evolved to a higher level of prophecy. And he's truly understood God's will. Okay, so is everybody with me up until this point? Okay, and what's interesting about that also is that Maimonides has threaded a very important needle, which is that according to Maimonides, God has not really changed at all. God in God's fullness, right, the end of the process for God is that God doesn't want child sacrifice. But when Abraham, anybody see the movie The Hunt for Red October? Right? If you remember the movie, there's like a garbled message to launch the nuclear weapons, right? That gets through. Okay. And that becomes this whole problem, right, for in the world of the Hunt for Red October, right? There's a coup and there's all this disagreement of how can you do this unless you're absolutely sure. And very similarly, Abraham, according to Maimonides, when he gets the message, he's only getting the garbled message. He's only getting part of the message. Okay, so first of all, that's a very interesting, I just think it's a very interesting take. Okay, but it does leave, you're still left with the question, with the following problem. There's still a part of God that does tell Abraham to sacrifice his son. Okay, even if you want to say that Abraham didn't get the whole message, right, and that in the end he gets the whole message, there's still a part of God that, even if it's a low message, that says to Abraham, sacrifice your son. And we're left with this question, to go back to Harold, why is there a part of God that wants Abraham to sacrifice your son? And I want to push you, right? Because if you want to have this argument with people within religion, it's not enough to say, just ignore that part of the story. You have to take seriously that part of the story. And of all the questions, I think it's the most problematic one. And the answer to that is maybe, and I would argue probably is problematic to modern ears, but I think it's important for us to understand, right? Even if we disagree. And the answer to that is that there is a part of God, certainly within the Bible, and not only a part of God, but a part of the ancient Near East, that found child sacrifice to be not only permissible, but laudable. Now you can say, that's terrible, that's awful, and I do say that, but I think it's good to at least understand, in what worldview could that possibly be good? And to explain that, now, first of all, and just in terms of its prevalence, I'll read you one passage at the bottom of 117. Kohler writes, the Tophet in Carthage, the largest and best studied of these sites, apparently contains tens of thousands of children. Okay, don't think that this was just an Israelite or a Jewish thing, okay? In Carthage, archaeologists have found places where tens of thousands of children were sacrificed, interred from the 8th through the 2nd centuries BCE. In some centuries, these were interred at a rate of 2 per week. Repeated study has shown that this Tophet mostly contains children between 1 and 6 months old, clustering around a month and a half. I want to say it's very interesting for me to teach this with my youngest son sitting next to me, okay? And with my mother here on the page, right? So one, we should know that child sacrifice in the ancient world was common, okay? It certainly was not an anomaly. But then the question becomes, well, why was that the case? And the answer is based on 2 factors. Number one is that it was understood to be an appropriate act of gratitude, an appropriate expression of gratitude to God. And I want to share my screen with you. And I want to show you how there are remnants of this within the Bible as we have it. So in addition to the Akedah, I put here on the page a passage from Exodus. In the middle of the Exodus, God says to the Jewish people, consecrate to me every firstborn man, right, or human, and beast. The first issue of every womb among the Israelites is mine. Now, why, by the way, why is that? Just in the story of the Exodus? Somebody tell me. Sky? You have to come off mute, Sky.
Oh, okay. Because this was in Exodus, so because of the Exodus, I assume partially, depending on when
But what
this
particular
was
part of the
said,
Exodus?
of slaying all the firstborn Egyptians.
Good. Okay. God, in freeing the Israelites, slays all of the firstborn of the Egyptians, but spares the Israelites. Okay. And God says, I did, that was very nice of me. That was very nice of me. So moving forward, I expect you to consecrate to me the firstborn of all of your womb. Okay. Now, when it comes to animals, animals are sacrificed. Okay. When it comes to human beings, there is something, and it's continued to be practiced to this day, thank God, called pidyon haben, where you don't sacrifice the firstborn male of a mother's womb, but you do, they are understood to be the property of the Kohen, right? And I'm actually a Kohen, right? And what happens is people give the Kohen 5 silver coins as a way of saying, I'm paying my debt to God, right? And you're the priest, so I'm paying my debt to God by giving you these 5 silver coins that allows me to keep what actually should be God's, okay? And I just want to show you another place in the Bible, Exodus chapter 22, verses 28 through 29. You shall not put off the skimming of the first yield of your vats. You shall give me the firstborn among your sons. You shall do the same with your cattle, your flocks. 7 days it shall remain with his mother. On the 8th day, you shall give it to me. So sacrificing is, number one, understood to be a form of gratitude. And number two is and this goes back a little bit to Leibovitz's understanding, there's something incredibly pure and there's something incredibly pure about sacrificing your son because you love your son very much. And when we in the Jewish tradition want to describe, when somebody dies, there are a whole bunch of funeral practices. And the tradition calls those chesed shel emet, an act of true loving kindness. And why is it called an act of true chesed, an act of true loving kindness? Because the person can't pay you back. They're dead. What that means is that your doing it is not contaminated by a sense of quid pro quo. I'm doing this action knowing that there's nothing in it for me, right? In other places, right, we're doing a lot of thinking about judges, right? In Deuteronomy, it will say, and Judy, you know this very well, judges may not take bribes. And you can't take a bribe because according to the Bible, a bribe blinds the eyes of judges. And the concern, right, is that are you doing an action for God to treat God as the holy vending machine in the sky, who, if you put in the right coins, is going to give you the candy that you want. And that is instrumentalizing your relationship with God. And in offering up your son, because it's something that's actually so painful to you, you are proving in some way, right? So it's gratitude, but it's also, there's a purity to it. You're proving in some way that this is only, to use Leibovitz's term, is only about obedience. Now, one thing which I'll also point out to you is that we make a mistake if we only read the Akedah as the story of Abraham sacrificing his son, the one who he loves. Because you have to remember that Isaac is not just the son who he loves. According to the rabbis, Abraham actually loves Ishmael also. And that's why God has to say ultimately it's Isaac, right? Because Abraham says, I love both Isaac and Ishmael. what is at stake in sacrificing Isaac? It's not just that he's his son. Isaac is the son of the two in whom the covenant is going to be carried on. Isaac is the one who is going to carry forward the very promise that has been the project between God, the covenant between God and Abraham. And ultimately what Abraham is asking for, Moshe Halbertal explains this in another piece. Some of you may have heard me quote this before. He says that God suffers from what's called the rich spouse syndrome. So if you're very, very rich and you get married, right, the rich spouse is always worried, did this person, just a little part of me, did they love me? Or did they just marry me for my money? And God suffers from this, according to Halbertal, because God is always wondering, does Abraham just love me because I've promised him that his stars are going to be, his children, his descendants are going to be like the stars of the heaven and the sands of the sea? Or does Abraham just love me for me? And that in asking Abraham to sacrifice his son, but also the project, there's a purity that Abraham achieves. Okay, so ultimately, where does that leave us? Where does it leave us? And I want to read to you this paragraph because it's in my mind it's just fascinating. The way that that Kohler describes the metaphor that he uses for God desiring child sacrifice, but in the end, following, in the end, the part of God in the end doesn't want the, Abraham to follow through on it. He says, and I really have to find this because it's that good. He says, it is certainly a psychological commonplace for a person to want something, but to not want it even more. And let me say that again. It's psychologically commonplace for a person to want something, but to not want something even more. Now listen to this. Consider, all of us know this example, a health-conscious person looking at a piece of cake. That person may want the cake. Okay, I got some cheesecake in my refrigerator. I want the cake. Although in the end, hopefully, right, at least for the particular moment, you decide not to eat it. Okay? The rejection of the cake is a statement not of the cake's despicability or fundamental abhorrence, right? When I decide not to eat the wonderful cheesecake that my mom makes me, right? God forbid, right, that you think that I'm saying that my mother's cheesecake is abhorrent or despicable, right? What I'm trying to say in that moment is I desire health. My desire for health is even more powerful than my desire for confection. In the religious realm, he says, and he brings examples of how this plays itself out in the religious realm as well. But according to Kohler, God in the Bible, what Abraham, according to Maimonides, is picking up on in the first verses of the Akedah is a desire for God to, for Abraham to sacrifice his son, right? It's real. God likes it just like we like the cake. Why? Because God is owed some of what we have, right? We none of us created the world. We all enjoy the world, right? That is a very, very basic religious notion that we owe a debt to God for the things that we have. And number two, that it's a really nice gesture that sort of shows how grateful and how deeply you do love God, right? So there's a part of God that Abraham is picking up on that's real, right? Just like we want the chocolate cake. But at the end, God doesn't want the sacrifice because God is health conscious and says, more than I want the cake, right? I want health, right? More than I want the sacrifice, I don't want the sacrifice because of all that goes along with that. And one other piece, do you have another 5 or 10 minutes if we go a little bit late? Okay, there's one other piece that I think is worth exploring. He has another wonderful chapter on rejecting child sacrifice, okay? Because the Bible ultimately does reject child sacrifice, and it's not just here in the Akedah that we see that the Bible is a text that is paradigm changing away from child sacrifice. Obviously, you know, the Bible predates all of those children who were sacrificed at Tophet, at Carthage. So, you know, the Bible hasn't won that war yet, but ultimately, you know, child sacrifice is extremely rare now. So the Bible won the long-term war. And where do we see that? I want you to listen. I didn't give this to you in writing, but just listen for a moment to the Hammurabi Code, okay? The Hammurabi Code states as follows. If a builder builds a house for a person and doesn't construct it properly, and the house which he built falls and kills its owner, according to the Hammurabi Code, the builder should be put to death. Okay? So this is, you know, it's kind of eye for an eye, okay? But the idea is that the builder is responsible for his work. His work cost the owner his life, and the builder has to pay with his life. But listen to the second part. If it kills the son of the owner, the son of that builder shall be put to death. Everybody understand? So if the owner of the house, if that owner's son gets killed, the builder isn't put to death, but the builder's son has to be put to death. And what the Hammurabi Code represents is a worldview where children are a legal extension, an adjunct to their parents. Everybody understand that? Children are not separate from their parents. Children are essentially property of their parents, and therefore, when if the man who's the builder owes a debt of a child to the house, then the builder's child can be put to death because the child falls under the rubric of the parents. But now I want you to look at, I'm going to share my screen, and I want you to look at a passage from the Torah. Sorry, I have to shrink it just so I can see. Exodus chapter 21, verses 28 through 31. When an ox gores a man, so an ox is your property. When an ox gores a man or a woman to death, the ox shall be stoned, and its flesh shall not be eaten, but the owner of the ox is not to be punished. If, however, the ox has been in the habit of goring and its owner, though warned, has failed to guard it, and it kills a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned, and its owner too shall be put to death, because the owner has neglected their responsibility to keep their mischievous and ill-behaved ox appropriately. Okay, so, but look at this. If ransom is laid upon him, he must pay whatever is laid upon him to redeem his life. So too, if it gores a minor, male or female, the owner shall be dealt with according to the same rule. Sorry, I think, hold on, there was one more. Sorry, this should say not male or female, but if you look in the Hebrew, a better translation of the Hebrew is, if it gores a son or a daughter, the same law shall apply to him. So I want to read to you, just in case it's not totally clear, I'm going to read to you Kohler's analysis of this. He says this final clause is best understood as a rejection of the practice elsewhere, which would have dictated that if it gores a son or daughter, the son or daughter of the ox's owner shall be put to death. That would be the Hammurabi Code. Again, this is actually rejected by biblical law, which treats children as full people in this law. An ox that gores a person, child, or adult is to be put to death. The ox is to be put to death, but not the children of the owner. Okay? And so he writes, why does the biblical law part with its Mesopotamian counterparts? The issue seems to be precisely the status of the child. While in Mesopotamia, children were legally seen as the property of their parents and therefore appropriate vehicles for punishment of parents, this was rejected in biblical thought. If this is rejected, other results follow. Primarily for our purposes is the question of child sacrifice. And ultimately, the Bible rejects child sacrifice because, and this is sort of the, if you've fallen asleep and you're just now waking up, here's the final crescendo. Because ultimately, God has, even though God desires the chocolate cake of child sacrifice, God has a more powerful lesson to teach, which is that children, like other human beings, cannot be adjuncts in someone else's religious experience. Children and other people can't just be the means for your path to have a religious experience with God. And so this is the ethical teaching of the Akedah. As much as it is enticing to do so, one person's religious fulfillment cannot come through harm to another. The trial of Abraham cannot involve the murder of Isaac. And this is what fundamentally he argues differentiates Kierkegaard and the 19th and 20th century, what he would argue, misunderstandings of the Akedah, because Kierkegaard calls Abraham the knight of faith, but ignores that Isaac is there with him on the mountain. The test is not just, can Isaac do something, right? But, and the other point he makes is that we miss this when we retell the story. There are two commands in the story of the Akedah. The first one is sacrifice your son. Yeah, we heard that one. But there's a second divine command.
Lay not a hand upon the boy.
Don't lay a hand upon your child. That's also divine. And what we do is we stop listening. And his argument would be that Kierkegaard and Leibovitz and Soloveitchik and this whole line of reasoning stop listening at the first divine command. And we ignore the second divine command, which is don't do it. But that's also divine. According to Maimonides, that's actually the highest level of prophecy, right? Because it's through an angel and not through a dream. And what's very powerful to me, and I'll conclude with this, and then we can take some questions or reactions. But what's so powerful to me about this argument is that it takes seriously the text of the Torah, which contains this puzzling question that Harold asked, which is, how could God ask for this, right? And while we may, find it abhorrent that there's even a part of God that would want child sacrifice, I hope that we can at least understand the biblical worldview and not reject it wholeheartedly, right? I hope that you do not reject the idea of us owing a debt to God for that which we have, right? That's the basis of saying any blessing before we eat, When you say a blessing before you eat, you're saying, I didn't create the earth. I didn't create seeds. I didn't create rain. I didn't create the miraculous process through which food arrives to my plate. So I can feel a sense of gratitude, right? And God wants that gratitude and actually even expects it as a debt, right? And expects it in relation to what happened at the Exodus, right? Because the firstborn were saved. So it takes seriously why it is that that first command exists. I think Maimonides would say exists as an instinct within God, but like all, somebody else, and forgive me, I can't remember who described it this way, but describes idolatry, that the essence of idolatry is taking the part and saying that it's the whole. In other words, it's pointing at an object and saying, this is God, right? The Hasidim actually said, hey, look, God is everywhere, right? There's nothing wrong with saying that God is in this stapler, right? Because God is part of all creation. The problem is if you say, this is God, right? Because what you're doing is you're taking the part and saying, this is the whole, right? And but it's not only that God is in the stapler, God is everywhere. God is one and in the oneness all around us. So the mistake is making part of the whole. And the mistake, the intellectual and religious mistake that Kohler argues Kierkegaard and Malbim and also the Ishbitzer and Soloveitchik and Leibovitz are making is that they're making an idol of the first command of God to sacrifice Isaac, and they're not seeing the whole story. They're not seeing Isaac up there on the mountain, and they're not seeing the fact that God also commanded to take him down. And they're not seeing the Bible moving away from seeing children as property and understanding children as beings in and of themselves, through which one is not permitted to just make use in order to have a religious experience. Let me stop. I hope that followed and made some sense. Please feel free to argue or to yell or to ask questions. I see Howard, you already came off mute. Welcome. And let me take your first question.
Well, I want to give an
For folks who need to drop off, I wish you a good day. Have a good day.
I want to offer an alternative theory that you're starting from the premise that God means what he's saying. The view I like the best is God plans right from the beginning to say he's going to stop Abraham from killing Isaac. Go back to Sodom and Gomorrah. God is proud that Abraham has internalized his moral code so strongly that he takes the step of respectfully asking God, if there were 50 men just and true, would you do this? He challenges God, and he stops at 10, the minion, the singular element. So he's hoping that Abraham will challenge him respectfully again. So he's so proud of Abraham. There's two things. The praise he's the one who says God should, Abraham should kill, but he sends the angel. It's to stop him. Looking at Abraham now is distasteful to him. He has failed, and he doesn't talk to Abraham again in the Bible. He speaks to him all the time in the beginning before this, but he stops speaking to him after that. Abraham has failed the test.
So I'm not, let me make a couple of things clear. I'm not making the argument that this is the only way, right? I'm showing it, and I appreciate those comments. I'm going to push back a little bit for the following reasons. Number one, you said that God is proud that Abraham has stepped forward and asserted his moral compass. A close reading of that story, the only evidence that we can adduce is that God does not kill Abraham for speaking up so brashly. But the text at no point says, and God smiled, or, God was proud that Abraham knew that, or something like that. The text gives no indication. as opposed to at the end of the Akedah, where we have testimony, you're right, is from an angel, but where we're told that God says, now I know, right, that you are someone who fears God, and essentially I think we lost Howard. That's always the best way to win an argument with someone, is if they just, drop off. But essentially that the Akedah actually ends with the text attesting to Abraham's God's happiness, and Sodom and Gomorrah does not end that way. And there's nothing in this text which indicates that God is happy, except that God listens. Right now, you could say, well, God listens, and that's pretty good, right? But I think that's a little bit different than the text sort of speaking up and saying, wow, that was the best thing ever, right? Sky, go ahead.
Okay. Interestingly enough, I think the Akedah reminds me a lot of a story, I think in the Midrash, I think when Moses gets to the shore and the people kind of start freaking out because there's an ocean and there's no way they can cross it. And I think that someone just starts stepping in. They don't expect a miracle, but they just kind of begin stepping into the water until it parts.
And how does that remind you of the Akedah?
And I feel like that is kind of similar to,
Analogy.
sacrificing your son, and you don't exactly know what's going to happen to a certain extent, but you just keep going with what someone said to a certain extent, believing that this will turn out for the better, even though in no way does it look like it's going to turn out for the better.
Right. So there's a certain level of faith that, by the way, it is from the Midrash. Nice job. It's Nachshon ben Aminadav, right, who sort of says, I need to walk into the water and know that this is going to work itself out okay. In that way, Nachshon and maybe Nachshon and Avraham have that in common, right?
Yeah.
Other responses, questions about it? Judy, go ahead. Judy, you're on mute.
So everything that most of the emphasis, the ethical emphasis in the story is on the idea that a person should sacrifice his child in order to demonstrate his faith to God. But actually, one of the things that distresses me as well is there, as we would call the tort today, intentional infliction of emotional distress, what God did to Abraham, not just what he was willing to do to Isaac to prove Abraham's faith, because, as I said, there was intentional infliction of emotional distress, which is a tort in law today. I wonder if you would talk about that, even though it turned out well, that seeming cruelty along the way.
So I think that the strength of Maimonides' reading is that God is not inflicting, and it's a subtlety, but for Maimonides, the prophet is listening. So I'll say this more broadly. For Maimonides, prophecy is not God speaking. It is the prophet who is refining and learning and sort of improving his character more and or her character more and more and more and more to have a better and better understanding of the truth of God. But the truth of God is actually external and to be discovered. It's almost like when they found the Big Bang, they became aware of this buzzing, right, that was in the out there in the universe, right? And they said, this is a little weird, right? And so I don't think that Maimonides would say that God was intentionally inflicting this upon Abraham. I think Maimonides would say, even though, Judy, to your point, it says God tried Abraham, but I think Maimonides would say that that trial, and the rabbis, by the way, also play with this. I'll show it to you on the screen. The rabbis were geniuses. So the Akedah begins with the words in Hebrew, Vayihi achar hadivarim ha'eleh, which is translated, I think in our translation, it says after, sometime afterward. That's not even, Vayihi achar hadivarim ha'eleh means, and it was after these divarim. And divarim is either things, but it can be words.
Right.
And because it can be words, the rabbis ask the question, well, what words, right? And they imagine conversations. And one of the conversations that they imagine is this contest between Isaac and Ishmael, where Ishmael says to Isaac, almost teasing him, you had your circumcision at 8 days old. I had it at 13 years old, right? So, you think you love God. That didn't really hurt you. I love God a lot, and I'm 13. And Isaac responds by saying, you know what? If God asked me to sacrifice my whole body, I would do that. And so the Akedah, according to the rabbis, is prompted by not necessarily, it awakens something within God, right? But it's actually prompted, it comes from Isaac's insecurity and desire to prove himself, right? Another conversation that the rabbis imagine is that Abraham is in conversation with himself. And he says, I've done a lot of partying. I've thrown a lot of parties. I had a party, and if you read just before this, there's a weaning, right? Abraham throws a party weaning Isaac. It may not be just before, there's a couple chapters, but and he throws a big party. And Abraham says to himself, I wonder if all of this was for God, or whether it's just because I like food and I like good drink and I like a party. And and in that reading, it's Abraham's internal self-doubt that prompts the Akedah. I think Maimonides would say that ultimately it was not God who was inflicting purposeful punishment upon Abraham, but Abraham through his lower level of prophecy. And you can almost imagine this. I actually find it very compelling. You can almost imagine this, that Abraham has like a dream where he's like berating himself. Like, I wonder if I was, who I am. Who am I, right? Is all of this about me, or is all of this about God? And that within the dream, he hears God say to him, I want you to offer up your son, right? But it's actually coming from Abraham's subconscious of not knowing whether he's truly a servant of God or not. And he needs to clarify that. And I think Maimonides would say that's a lower level of prophecy. Abraham is sort of an unevolved religious individual, and that he comes to truly know God when he lets go of these doubts and is able to hear the other part of God that doesn't want him to sacrifice his son.
So is this notion that Abraham is doing this for himself as well as God is doing it to test Abraham?
So I think, again,
to test himself.
For Maimonides, I think Maimonides would argue that God is not testing Abraham, that there's a part of God that desires this, but that Abraham in his lower level of prophecy has misunderstood, has gotten the garbled message from The Hunt for Red October. And if you don't know the movie, it's a pretty good movie. So, Liz, go ahead.
I really like the idea of Abraham kind of getting the message garbled first and misunderstanding it. And maybe God wasn't actually saying literally go sacrifice your son. Because especially if in that context, children were considered as an extension of the parents, you know, Abraham could have been getting very proud about his children, or thinking more highly of himself or his children because of God's promise to him. And so there could have been sort of like something going on either between him and God or in his subconscious of almost holding this promise as an idol. And so in this garbled message of, well, it's not good to hold this as an idol. And then of course the surrounding culture is like, sacrifice your children, this is a good thing. It is really easy to see how Abraham could have misunderstood this and literally thought he should sacrifice his child. And then, so in that way, it's not so much that God changed his command or that God was intentionally testing Abraham. It's that Abraham was picking up on something that he misunderstood. And then God comes and clarifies and is like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Okay, I see that you're serious here, but we're not actually trying to kill anybody.
Right.
I really like that, that kind of alternative interpretation, because I have always heard of it as being a test.
Right.
And I like the idea that it's kind of it's a warning that's opposite of Kierkegaard. It's like practicing religion without ethics. It's like warning you against a non-ethical way of practicing religion. I think that's a really important takeaway.
And let me just finish. I'm going to thank you for that. And I'm glad you joined us. And you're welcome to join us anytime and always. I want to finish with actually something from his introduction that may bring us back out of this biblical world and into the world in which we live. You know, not only is it sort of warning us against the ethical, but the other thing, you heard me say that in the Kierkegaard's notion of religion is also highly individual and not, it's incommunicable and it's individual rather than public and communal. And I think, you know, one of the strengths of Judaism for me is, and why I'm a conservative rabbi, is that conservative Judaism has an understanding, and rabbinic Judaism more generally, that figuring out what to do religiously is not up to the individual. And here I don't want to throw Reform Judaism under the bus as a movement, but intellectually Reform Judaism is actually, you know, based on the idea that it is up to the sovereign individual to decide what they should do. And philosophically, conservative Judaism rejects that idea that figuring out what to do is a communal process. I, as the Mara Da'atra, am given the responsibility for making decisions for the community, but only because, number one, I'm responsible to the community, and number two, I'm responsible to a communal tradition that goes back thousands of years. And I found these two sentences, or this paragraph, a really, really insightful observation, and I'll leave it with you to think about. It says, in the broader Western discourse of law and social policy, we also live in a Kierkegaardian world. The courts have exempted religious organizations from providing their employees with health plans that even so much as authorize a third party to provide contraceptives. This is said to violate their freedom of religion. The New York City Board of Health announced an insistence on vaccinations for all children attending preschool and day school programs. Quote, children with a valid religious exemption, however, will not be required to be vaccinated. What he writes is such an understanding of the freedom of religion. In other words, my freedom of religion is to not get vaccinated. So, right, my freedom of religion is I don't have to provide, healthcare to an employee or to, policy that does contraceptives, right? He says such an understanding of the freedom of religion derives from Kierkegaard's notion that for a religious person alone on the mountaintop, even ethics must be put aside for faith. Right? For Kierkegaard, and as we shall see other readers of the 19th and 20th centuries, Abraham being alone with God on the mountaintop is critical to understanding the religious point of the story, the fundamentally personal nature of faith, the incommunicability of religious devotion, the zealousness of the faithful that takes precedent even over one's own moral compass. And I would say not only your own moral compass, but also the community's moral compass. And so what he's arguing is that actually modern America and a lot of Western discourse has absorbed this idea that what religion is, that faith is actually can be anti-ethical, and faith is primarily the possession of the individual, and that the individual sort of has ultimate authority over that. And what I would say is in Judaism, it's much more noisy, right? We're not quiet, right? We yell and scream at each other, and we figure out what is faithful and ethical through a communal process. And I think normal rabbinic Judaism has been suspicious of the individual access to God and of some sort of access to God which is incommunicable to other human beings. Right? So I leave that with everybody as something to think about. I think there's a profound issue there, and say thanks to everybody for joining. You stuck with it for a good long time. So. And Mom, take care. Love you. All right, I'm going to sign off. Bye-bye. Oh, let me stop the recording. Right.